Hi, I'm Charles Welch. I was born and raised in Northwest Ohio. For nearly 50 years, Toledo has been the place that I call home. The history of Toledo has become one of my passions. Some people say, let the past stay in the past. I say, let the past guide us to the future. Join me on my journey to find out who we were and how we got to be who we are. This is Untold, the hidden stories of Northwest Ohio. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Untold. I'm your host, Charles Welch. I'm standing inside of a museum dedicated to the life of Ella P. Stewart. It's located inside the Ella P. Stewart Academy for Girls right here in the city of Toledo. For me, the name Ella P. Stewart has always rung a bell. She has a school named after her, and people often talk about her impact on our community. I had a chance to catch up with Adjunct Professor of History and the Director of the Toledo Police Museum, Ms. Shirley Green. We had a chance to talk about Ella P. Stewart, her life, her legacy, and her impact on our city. We're here with another episode of Untold. And, you know, there's a lot of times where we get the chance to talk about events on this show, and this time we get the chance to talk about a person, and I am so happy to have you as my guest, Ms. Shirley Green. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. And now listen, I have grown up in Toledo my entire life, right. my past 51 years, wow, 51 years. And there's certain names and places and things that show up and we don't know where they came from. And one name that I've known and heard all of my life and not really known the story of is the story of Ella P. Stewart. I know generally who she was and what she was, but tell me the story of Ella P. Stewart.
Wow, I don't even know where to begin.
Well, let's do it like this. Okay. Let's start from the beginning. Was she born in Toledo or was she born elsewhere?
Ella P. Stewart's story is an amazing story. She wasn't born and raised in Toledo. She came here as an adult, but her story before that really helps explain what comes of her life, right? Mm-hmm. So she was born and raised in Virginia. And she got married as a young woman. Her first marriage was to a black chauffeur. And they had a young child, and they lost that young child to the whooping cough disease back in the day. And after she lost her child, she was told by friends that she really needed to do something else to get her out of that melancholy. So she took a job as a bookkeeper for a pharmacy company. And she started to really become engaged and interested in the work of the pharmacists, right? So she decided that she would go to school. First, she had to get accepted into the pharmacy school, right, which was very, very difficult for her, but Ella P. Stewart was anything but persistent. I like to say that she was relentless, fearless, and very persistent. And she was able to get admission into the University of Pittsburgh's pharmacy school, but as she was there, she got her education under very segregated circumstances. For instance, when they were in the classroom, the way the classroom setup was, the white male students got the seats in the front row, and then slowly but surely, the next row of seats were designated for maybe Jewish American men, and then women, and then the black female at the back of the class. So the way that she got her education was different than the white males in her class, but she persevered and got her degree from the University of Pittsburgh. She was the first African American woman to get her pharmacy degree from that school. And that's how she started on that path that eventually led her to Toledo.
While in school at the University of Pittsburgh, Ella Phillips fell deeply in love with a local pharmacy clerk. His name was William Stewart, but many people simply called him Doc. Ella would soon marry Doc, and the two would end up moving to the city of Detroit. Ella wasn't too keen on living in the big city and yearned for somewhere smaller where she could open up her own pharmacy. Just south of Detroit, Ella visited Toledo, Ohio, and came across a building that she fell in love with. Before long, Ella and Doc were new Toledoans looking to make their mark.
She was able to find a building at City Park in Indiana, where eventually they would open up their pharmacy, and they lived above the pharmacy for several years. She walked into that building and she knew that was the building for her. So they decided to establish the pharmacy there. But in 1922 is when they opened up their pharmacy. At that period of time, that neighborhood at City Park in Indiana was going through transition.
Okay.
At that point, when she first opened up the pharmacy, it was a German-American, Irish-American, Polish-American neighborhood called Links Hill.
Oh.
And that neighborhood was predominantly white. And as her business grew, she and her husband, Doc Stewart, saw that neighborhood transition from a German immigrant, Polish immigrant neighborhood to a predominantly black neighborhood that we know it of today.
Wow. They say they lived above the pharmacy.
Yes, they did.
So was it a? Now, I don't. The building's not there anymore.
No, it's
right.
not.
The building's not there anymore.
Which is a shame.
But do we know? I know that would be great to have that building still there. Do we know? Was it a nice size place, or I mean, did they have rooms?
She describes the apartment that they lived in above the pharmacy as a 9-room apartment. And sometimes when people would come over to the pharmacy after hours, they would just knock on their door, the upstairs apartment, and they'd come down and try to help individuals at the pharmacy after hours. Yes, definitely. And one of the most important, I think one of the focal points of the pharmacy, if you look at some of the old pictures, was this 16-foot-long fountain bar that they would serve ice cream and stuff at. Also, as well as doing the business of putting out prescriptions and things of that nature.
Wow. So you have the soda fountain.
Yes.
And the drugs.
And the drugs. And other things like cigarettes, and pharmacies back in the day, they did the prescriptions and things like that, but they also sold other items that you would see at a convenience store now.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So cigarettes and other necessities that people would come to need during that period of time.
Ella and Doc quickly built a reputation as honest, hardworking people. For years, the Stewarts served their community and developed lifelong relationships with all of their customers. For the African Americans that were migrating from the South, Stewart's Pharmacy represented more than just a place to get your medication. It was seen as a beacon of hope and a place to call their own. Soon, Ella's work as a neighborhood pharmacist would lead her down an illustrious path of community activism and engagement. So, the pharmacy ends up closing in the 40s?
1945.
And so that freed up more of her time to do other things.
Right. The pharmacy was a focal point of that community for almost 25 years. In 1945, they decided to close. But she had already started to work through the Enterprise Charity Club locally to try to advance the cause of African American women and families in this area. What Mrs. Stewart started to do was try to help these young women as they came into the city of Toledo. And the Enterprise Charity Club was a black female-led organization that saw to the needs of the urban poor. Okay. And they tried to help them and guide them and make sure they got the proper resources, make sure they had food in their homes and things of that nature.
This Enterprise Charity Club was a women's club,
yes,
right?
It's a women's club, and it was one of the leading charity clubs among Negroes in the city of Toledo. They were doing charity work because there were so many Negro people that were coming from the South that didn't have anything because the various firms were going down, bringing them up, and just giving them probably a place to stay where big families would be, maybe 2 or 3 families in one place. And as the people would move out they would rent to them and get the rent. People began to buying in the neighborhood and whatnot. But they're the ones that would go and get baskets of food if they needed food. Some of them had worked on the farms. They didn't know how to cut the grass and the weeds and things. Down south, they didn't have to have shades and things like we have here. They'd have newspapers up. We'd go and get them some curtains and show them how to make the curtains, or else make them for them and take them and put them up. And not too many of them were working. There were more housewives.
She and other members of these local women's groups would come together to form a larger group. And the larger group would become known as the National Association for Colored Women. But the initial group was formed in 1896 at the end of the 19th century. And if you listen to some of the names of the founding members of this group, it's just an amazing amazing number of very, very influential African American female leaders. Harriet Tubman was one of the organizers of this group. Ida B. Wells Barnett was an organizer of the group. Mary Church Terrell was an organizer of the group. And these individuals, they started the precursor to the National Association for Colored Women. And that was the umbrella organization for all of these local groups like the Enterprise Charity Club to come under and just to interact and network on a more national level. In 1944, she became the president of the Ohio Association of Black Women's Clubs, right? And that was like a stepping stone for her, and eventually 4 years later, she became the national president for the organization, the National Association for Colored Women. She was the point person in leading a lot of their very, very important themes that they were trying to accomplish. They worked on expanding job and economic opportunities for Black women and Black families, and they also worked on lobbying to get anti-segregation laws passed in terms of transportation and in terms of housing and in terms of accommodations. So she was at the forefront of all of those fights as the leader of the National Association for Colored Women. And I like to look at those groups as being the precursor to the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and in the 60s. That those individuals that led the civil rights movement of the 60s were really standing on the shoulders of those individuals that were working in the 40s.
Recognized by many as a pioneer when it came to the rights of women and African Americans, Ella P. Stewart stood firm when it came to the fight for equality. She was recognized for her tenacity and placed on an international stage, becoming a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations.
As she worked her way through these national organizations, she also started to be well known on the international stage. She was named as an ambassador out of the UN and the UNESCO program, where she was a Goodwill Ambassador, and she would travel to Asia. She traveled to Pacific Islands. She was a member of an association that is still operating now. It's the Pan-Pacific South Asian Women's Group that they meet, and they would conduct conventions all over the world. There are pictures in her scrapbooks of Ella P. Stewart at these various conventions in the island nation of Tonga, in Greece, in India. So she traveled all over the world. She was always interacting with young women and trying to mentor them, and that's the work that she conducted with all these different groups that she was involved with. So to go back to the Ella P. Stewart School, which is how we all know her here in Toledo, right? Since the pharmacy closed in 1945, unless you were older, you don't remember her being in the pharmacy, but everyone knows about the Ella P. Stewart School. And it was built in 1960. And I think they dedicated it to her when it was finished in 1961. And that was so important to her because all of the work that she had done with young people and with Black families and education and educational opportunities were always very important to her. She was instrumental in getting Black female students in the nursing schools here.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that. And so, like you mentioned, we have another Ella P. Stewart school, and is there a historical museum-ish essence to it? Right.
When they opened up the school in '61, several years later, they decided to actually put a Ella P. Stewart museum in that school as well, and now it's known as Ella P. Stewart Charter School for Girls. There's a bust of her in the school, and she's she was very happy to have that museum put in the school to really chronicle her life.
That's cool. Wow, it's so cool to have the story of someone who is so pivotal and so local, amongst us. So she's really a figure that's basically larger than life. She's done a lot and accomplished a lot.
Yeah, she started to be recognized later in life for all of her accomplishments. She was inducted into the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. She received an honorary degree from the University of Toledo. She also was acknowledged as a distinguished alumni from the school that didn't want her to attend at the University of Pittsburgh Pharmacy School.
Well, that's cool. You know what? I just want to thank you for stopping by and sharing your knowledge of Ella P. Stewart, because like I said, I've been here my entire life and I've heard the name and I knew she was a pharmacist. That was my extent of it basically. And I don't think people realize the gem that we had that was Ella P. Stewart. Is there any final thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, if people want to learn more about Ella P. Stewart and what she did locally, nationally, and internationally, they can go to the Bowling Green State University website, their library page, and she's part of the digital collection there. So you can read more about her on their website.
Wow. Well, Shirley Green, thank you very much
You're
for
welcome.
stopping by. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Fearless, bold, stern, unapologetic. These are all words that best describe Miss Ella P. Stewart. Her legacy lives on through the school that bears her name and the countless families that she helped locally, nationally, and internationally. A larger-than-life figure that called Toledo home. I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of Untold. Hopefully you learned something new today. For BCAN, I'm your host, Charles Welch, and we'll see you next time.
Untold, the hidden stories of Northwest Ohio, is brought to you by Holy Toledo History, an archive of stories dedicated to Toledo's past. Log on now at holytoledohistory.com. Your time is now. Realtor Charles Welch will handle your every need. Just choose Charlie.